Margaret Holloway slammed her iron pot down on that filthy counter and looked every man on the Whitaker Ranch dead in the eye. 40 cowboys had just watched her climb off a supply wagon, a plus-size woman in a worn brown dress, carrying nothing but a small bag and one old cooking pot, and every single one of them had laughed. She heard it all. Every whisper, every cruel joke. Every man who decided in the first 3 seconds that she was a mistake. She did not flinch. She did not apologize. She did not explain herself. She looked at that broken, empty kitchen, the filthiest room she had ever walked into, and she said 4 words that would change everything on this ranch forever. How many mouths today? Nobody laughed after that. If this story already has, you hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss what happens next. And drop a comment telling me what city or state you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far one iron pot can travel. The advertisement had been tacked to the board outside the general store in Bitter Creek for 11 days before Margaret Holloway finally stopped walking long enough to read it. She had passed it 3 times already that week, each time telling herself it wasn't meant for her. The work was too far out. The pay was uncertain. The ranch had a reputation that made decent women cross the street when the cowboys from Whitakerland rode through town. But on the 11th day, Margaret had exactly 37 cents left to her name, a pair of boots with a hole forming in the left sole, and a landlady who had already knocked twice that morning asking about the rent. She read the advertisement one more time. Need a woman willing to manage the ranch kitchen. Food, shelter, and payment provided. Inquire at Whitaker Ranch, 12 miles north. She stood there on that dusty Bitter Creek sidewalk, her iron pot wrapped in her shawl and tucked under one arm, and she made a decision. She was done being afraid of things that hadn't happened yet. The wagon ride out to Whitaker Ranch took most of the morning. The driver, a wiry old man named Earl who smelled of pipe, tobacco, and creek water, talked the entire way without once asking her name or her story. Margaret didn't mind. She watched the Montana Territory roll past and thought about her mother, who had once told her that the hardest kitchens always made the best cooks. She hoped her mother was right. When the wagon crested the final hill and Whitaker Ranch spread out below her, Margaret's first thought was that it was bigger than she'd imagined. Her second thought was that it looked exhausted, not run down exactly. The fences were standing. The barn was upright. But there was a heaviness to the place, like a man who keeps working long after his body has given up asking for rest. The yard was quiet in a way that felt wrong for a working ranch with 40 hands. The main house sat at the center of it all, with its curtains drawn on a perfectly bright morning. Earl pulled the wagon to a stop near the front gate and climbed down without offering his hand. Margaret climbed down on her own. She always had. A handful of cowboys near the fence noticed her arrival before she'd taken 3 steps toward the main house. She heard the first comment before the wagon dust had even settled. "Lord Almighty, is that the new cook? Must be. Nobody else would come out here by wagon dressed like that." Caleb's lost his mind. She's gonna break the floorboards in that kitchen. She kept walking. She had learned a long time ago that the men who laughed the loudest were usually the hungriest. Give it 2 days, and they'd be at her table with their hats in their hands. The front door of the main house opened before she reached it, and the man who stepped out was not what she expected. Caleb Whitaker was tall, wide-shouldered, and somewhere in his mid-30s, with the kind of face that had spent years squinting into the sun and wind. He wore a plain work shirt, no jacket, and his expression when he looked at her was not unkind, but it was careful. Like a man doing rapid arithmetic in his head and not entirely liking the answer. He looked at her. He looked at the iron pot under her arm. He looked back at her face. "You're here about the kitchen position," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Margaret said. "Margaret Holloway. I can start today if you need me to." Caleb was quiet for a beat longer than felt comfortable. She watched him weigh something behind his eyes, not cruelty, she decided, but uncertainty. The look of a man who'd been burned before and was trying to calculate the odds. "The last 4 women I hired left inside of a week," he finally said. "I'm not the last 4 women," Margaret answered. That seemed to land somewhere. He stepped back and gestured toward the side of the house. "Kitchen's around back. I'll show you what you're working with." What she was working with was, to put it plainly, a disaster. The kitchen was a large room tacked onto the back of the main house, built for function and nothing else. There were 2 big cast iron stoves, both of which needed cleaning. The counters were scarred wood, darkened with years of grease and smoke. The shelves were nearly empty. A few cans, a sack of cornmeal that had seen better days, a bucket of lard, and some salt pork wrapped in cloth. Caleb stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and watched her walk the room. She touched the edge of the stove, opened the pantry, picked up the cornmeal sack, felt its weight, set it back down. "How many men?" she asked. 42, counting myself and my foreman." "What time do they expect breakfast?" "Sunup." "Dinner?" "Noon, when they can get to it. Most days they can't." "Supper?" 6 o'clock. Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes moving around the room again. She was calculating, taking inventory not just of what was on the shelves, but of what the room could become with the right hands and enough patience. "You'll need more supplies," she said. "A full pantry, staples especially. Flour, dried beans, potatoes, onions, smoked meat if you can get it. And I'll need someone to fix the seal on that stove door, or we'll be fighting smoke every single morning." Caleb looked mildly surprised by the specificity. "I can arrange supplies. The stove I'll see to by tomorrow. Then I can start today," Margaret said again. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth yet, just the beginning of reconsideration. "All right, Miss Holloway," he said. "The room at the end of the hall is yours. Board and wages every 2 weeks. He paused. "You'll find the men aren't easy." Margaret set her iron pot down on the nearest counter, unwrapped the shawl from around it, and smoothed the cloth over her arm. "Neither am I," she said. Caleb almost smiled. She caught the corner of it before he turned and walked back toward the yard. She got to work. The first thing she did was light stoves, not to cook, but to heat water. She scrubbed every surface in that kitchen for 3 hours straight, while the afternoon light moved across the floor and the sounds of the ranch yard drifted in through the single window. Cowboys working horses, men hauling equipment, the low bark of the foreman giving orders. By 4 o'clock she had the kitchen cleaner than it had been in months. By 5 she had a pot of beans on the stove, salt pork rendering in a pan, and a batch of cornbread in the oven that would either come out perfect or come out wrong. And she had a feeling it was going to come out perfect because she needed it to. At 6:10 the Cowboys began filing into the dining hall. She heard them before she saw them, the stomp of boots, the low murmur of a long day's exhaustion, the particular silence of men who have learned not to expect much. The first man through the kitchen pass-through was a big barrel-chested cowboy with a gray beard and the deeply lined face of a man who'd worked outdoors his entire life. He stopped when the smell hit him, and for a full 2 seconds he just stood there. "Good Lord," he said quietly. Margaret slid a plate through the window. "You want to eat it or talk about it?" He took the plate. "Yes, ma'am." He walked away without another word. She fed 42 men that night with beans, cornbread, and stewed tomatoes she'd found at the bottom of a dusty shelf, seasoned with what little she had and stretched with the kind of skill that only comes from years of making do. She kept the line moving, kept the portions fair, and watched through the pass-through window as men who had sat down to dinner looking hollowed out slowly began to look human again. She didn't go out to the dining hall, not that first night. She stayed in her kitchen and worked, but she listened. She heard the shift in the room, the way the conversation, which had started as nothing more than the dull, flat exchange of tired men, slowly developed into something more, a story here, a laugh there. One man calling across the table to her about something that had happened that afternoon. Small things, but things. The gray-bearded cowboy, she'd find out later, his name was Henry Dawson. The oldest hand on the ranch and the unofficial conscience of the bunkhouse came back to the pass-through window when the plates were mostly cleared. He set his empty plate down and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "My mother used to cook beans like that," he said. "I thought I'd never smell that again in my life." Margaret took his plate. What was her name? He blinked like the question surprised him. Ruth Ann. She knew her business then, Margaret said. Good cooking doesn't come from recipes. It comes from giving a damn. Henry Dawson stared at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, and went back to the table. That was the first night. By the third morning, something had already shifted on the Whitaker Ranch, something subtle but real, the way the air changes before rain. The men were arriving at the dining hall earlier, staying a little longer. A couple of them had started helping carry dishes back to the kitchen without being asked, which apparently had never happened once in the entire history of the previous 4 cooks. Margaret noticed. She didn't make a big deal of it. She just made sure the biscuits were hot and the coffee was strong. But not everyone was warming to her. 3 days in, she was carrying a full pot of stew from the stove to the pass-through when she heard a voice low enough to be deniable, cruel enough to be deliberate. You'd think she'd have learned by now to stop eating what she's supposed to be serving. Laughter, quiet but real. She set the pot down on the counter without spilling a drop. She turned to the pass-through window and looked at the dining hall. There were 2 of them, young cowboys, probably no more than 20, sitting near the far end of the table and watching her with that particular brand of meanness that she'd come to recognize as insecurity wearing the costume of cruelty. She looked at them for exactly 3 seconds. Then she served the man directly in front of her a full ladle of stew, looked him in the eye, and said, "Eat while it's hot." She served every other man in that room. She served both of those young cowboys, who by then had the decency to look at their plates. And when the meal was done and the hall was clearing, she went back to her kitchen and scrubbed the pot and did not allow herself 5 seconds of doubt. She had not come to this ranch to be liked. She had come to feed people. But she was also watching and learning, because she had come to understand in those first few days that the Whitaker Ranch had a problem that went deeper than empty shelves and broken stoves. She saw it in the way the men moved around each other, cautious, clipped, the kind of careful distance that builds up when people have spent too long in close quarters, with no relief, no joy, no sense that tomorrow might be any different from today. She saw it in the way they rarely laughed, the way conversations died before they finished, the way men who ought to have been friends ate their meals in near silence. This ranch was surviving, but it had stopped living. She'd seen it before in other places, other kitchens. When a household loses its center, the place where people gather, not because they have to, but because they want to, everything slowly pulls apart. People stop trusting each other, start hoarding, start leaving. She was 3 days into this job, and she could already see what was happening here. She just wasn't sure yet what she was going to do about it. On the 4th evening, Caleb Whitaker appeared in the kitchen doorway after the supper rush had cleared. He stood there with his hat in his hands, she'd noticed. He always did that when he came to talk to her. Held his hat in both hands, like a man who'd been raised with manners and hadn't quite shaken them, and he looked around the kitchen with an expression she couldn't read. "The men are talking about the food," he finally said. "Good talking or bad talking?" Margaret asked, though she had a fair idea which. "Good. Henry Dawson told me it's the first time since spring he's seen men finish their plates." He was quiet for a moment. "That's something. It's a start," Caleb nodded. He looked like he wanted to say more and wasn't sure how. "You need anything for the kitchen?" he finally asked. "A barrel of flour if you can manage it. And dried apples if there's any to be had. I want to make pie on Sunday." He looked slightly surprised. "Pie. Men work harder when they've got something to look forward to," she said. "Sunday pie is something to look forward to." He was quiet again. Then I'll have Earl bring a supply run out by Saturday. I appreciate it. He nodded once more, started to turn. Mr. Whitaker. He stopped. The two young hands near the far end of the table, she said. The ones with the mouth on them. What are their names? His expression tightened. Connors and Webb. They giving you trouble? Nothing I can't handle, she said. I just like knowing people's names. Makes it easier to know what I'm working with. He studied her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite respect, but the thing that comes just before it. Webb is trouble looking for company, he said. Connors follows whoever leads. I'll speak to them. I don't need you to, Margaret said. I just wanted to know. He put his hat back on his head. You're an unusual woman, Miss Holloway. I'm a practical one, she said. There's a difference. He almost smiled again. She was starting to think that almost smile was the closest thing Caleb Whitaker got to laughing out loud. He left, and she turned back to her clean counter, and the list she was already making in her head for the week ahead. More beans, more cornmeal, dried apples, a sack of sugar if she could justify the expense. And something else, something she hadn't quite put into words yet, even inside her own mind, a plan to rebuild whatever it was this ranch had lost before she arrived. She had been hired to feed 40 men. She was starting to understand that feeding them food was only the beginning. On Saturday morning, the supply wagon arrived, and Margaret spent 3 hours unpacking and organizing every item with a precision that made Earl, who was tasked with carrying boxes, look at her with new respect. You run a tight kitchen, he observed, setting down a crate of canned tomatoes. Only kind worth running, she said. Last cook didn't even know where the spare pots were kept. I know where everything in this kitchen is, Margaret said. I've known since the first day. Earl shook his head slowly. You're something else, ma'am. You really are. She gave him a cup of coffee and a biscuit for the road, and he left looking considerably more cheerful than when he'd arrived. Sunday she made pie, 3 of them dried apple, with brown sugar and cinnamon and a crust that came out golden and flaky in a way that made even the oven feel like it was cooperating for once. She set them on the pass-through windowsill at 5 o'clock, and by 5:15, every man on the ranch had found a reason to walk past the dining hall. Henry Dawson was the first one in, as she'd expected. He looked at those pies the way a man looks at something he's half convinced is a mirage. Is that apple? He said. It is, Margaret said. He sat down. He folded his hands on the table like a man settling in for church. I haven't had apple pie since my wife passed, he said. 6 years. Margaret cut him the first slice herself. He ate it in silence, slowly, like he was trying to make it last as long as possible. When he finished, he set his fork down and looked up at her with eyes that were doing things he probably hadn't expected them to do. Thank you, he said. His voice was rough. Thank Ruth Ann, Margaret said quietly. She's the one who taught me. Henry blinked. Then he laughed, a real laugh, deep and sudden, the kind that seems to come up from somewhere that's been shut for a long time. And sitting there watching him laugh, Margaret felt something shift inside the kitchen walls. Like the room itself had taken a breath it had been holding for years. The other men filtered in. They ate pie. They talked, actually talked, not just exchanged words, but talked like people who had stopped holding everything at arm's length and decided, at least for one Sunday evening, to simply be in the same room together without all the weight of it. Webb and Connors sat at the far end, quieter than usual. She caught Webb looking at her twice with an expression she couldn't entirely read. She didn't look away when she caught him. He looked away first. Caleb sat at the head of the table. He ate his slice of pie slowly. He watched his men. Margaret watched him from the kitchen, through the pass-through, and saw something move across his face that she recognized because she'd felt it herself, once or twice, in other difficult seasons. It was the look of a man beginning to wonder if things might actually be all right. He caught her eye through the window. He didn't almost smile this time. He smiled, real and plain and full and startled, like a man who'd forgotten he knew how. Margaret turned back to her kitchen before she could let herself feel anything about that. She had work to do. She had been on this ranch 9 days. She was starting to understand that she was going to be here a good deal longer than she'd planned. And somewhere beneath the practical certainty of that, beneath the flour on her hands and the smell of cinnamon still warm in the air, and the sound of 40 men, talking like brothers for the first time in God, only knew how long she let herself feel, just for a moment, like she had found the one thing she hadn't known she was looking for. A place where what she had to give was exactly what was needed. She set that feeling aside carefully, covered it over with the next thing that needed doing. But she did not let go of it entirely. She kept it, small and steady like a coal banked against the cold. The morning after the Sunday pie, something on the Whitaker ranch had changed in a way that couldn't be undone. Margaret felt it the moment the first Cowboys came through for breakfast, the way they moved differently, easier, like men who'd put down something heavy the night before and hadn't yet picked it back up. Henry Dawson came in first, same as always, but this time he said good morning before he said anything else. A small thing, but on a ranch where men had spent months grunting past each other, small things were everything. She slid his plate through the window without comment. He nodded, like they'd made an agreement about something. By the time the morning rush was done and the yard was filling with the noise of a working ranch starting its day, Margaret was already planning the noon meal and making notes in the margins of her memory about what each man seemed to need that she hadn't found a way to give him yet. She had started thinking about them that way, not as 42 mouths to feed, but as 42 separate people with 42 separate hungers that went a good deal deeper than food. She was elbow-deep in bread dough when the trouble walked through her kitchen door. Not the dining hall door, the kitchen door, the one that was supposed to stay closed during working hours. Webb pushed it open without knocking. He was younger than she'd first estimated, maybe 19-20 at most, with a lean, angular face and the kind of eyes that were always looking for something to prove. He stood in the doorway with his thumbs hooked to his belt and looked around her kitchen the way a person looks at a room they've decided they have the right to be in. "You need something?" Margaret said. She didn't stop working the dough. "Just looking," Webb said. "Kitchen's closed during prep." "You know that. I wanted to see where the magic happens." He said the word magic with just enough of a curl to it to make it something other than a compliment. Margaret punched the dough down hard and shaped it into a round. She still didn't look at him. "There's no magic in here," she said. "Just work, which is something you might want to try." She heard him shift his weight. She could feel him recalibrating. He'd expected her to flinch or flutter or apologize. She'd done none of those things, and now he wasn't sure where to put himself. "You think you're something special," he said, "because the old man smiled at you over pie." Margaret finally looked at him, straight on, no hesitation. "I think I'm the person who feeds you 3 times a day," she said. "Which means you have 2 choices. You can treat me with basic decency and eat well. Or you can keep doing what you're doing and find out how creative I can get with portion sizes." She paused. "Your call, Mr. Webb." The silence stretched out long enough that she could hear the bread dough settling. Webb's jaw worked. His eyes went hard, then something else moved behind them. Something younger, something less certain. And he turned around and walked back out the door without another word. Margaret went back to her bread. Her hands were perfectly steady. But she'd heard something in that conversation she needed to think about. The particular way he'd said, "The old man smiled at you," like it was a thing that required explanation. Like it was a thing that had been noticed and discussed. Like it was a thing that mattered to people in ways she hadn't fully accounted for. She filed that away and kept working. Caleb found her that afternoon while she was taking stock of the remaining supplies. He came around the side of the house without the usual announcement of boots on the porch steps, and she heard him a half second after she might have liked to. "Webb came and talked to you this morning," he said. It wasn't a question, so she didn't treat it like one. He did. He tell you anything worth knowing? He told me more than he meant to, Margaret said, writing a number beside dried beans and moving on to salt. Most people do. Caleb leaned against the doorframe. He had a habit of doing that, taking up space in a doorway without quite crossing into the room, like a man who hadn't fully decided yet whether he was staying. I want to know if he's giving you problems, Caleb said. I told you before. I can handle Webb, that's not what I asked. Margaret stopped writing. She turned and looked at him with the same directness she'd used on Webb, though for entirely different reasons. Caleb Whitaker, she had decided, was a man who could tolerate honesty, maybe even needed it, given how many people around him seemed to say what they thought he wanted to hear. He's testing me, she said. That's all. He wants to know if I'll last. Same as you did the first day. Caleb's expression shifted. I wasn't testing you. You were calculating, she said. That's a polite version of the same thing. She kept her voice even, no edge to it. Just the truth, delivered flat. I don't hold it against you. I'd have done the same. He was quiet for a moment. Then you're not what I expected. Nobody ever is, Margaret said, and went back to her supply count. She heard him breathe out, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. I'll have Earl bring out another supply run midweek, he said. Anything specific you need? Brown sugar, dried apricots if he can find them. And see if there's any molasses to be had. I want to try something with the Saturday bread. Molasses, Caleb repeated, like he was writing it down in his head. For the bread, she said again. The men are starting to eat more. That's good, but it means I need more to work with. They are eating more, he said. I noticed. They're doing other things too, Margaret said. Talking more, laughing more. Connors helped old Dawson move a fence post yesterday afternoon. First time in 2 months those two have worked side by side, without someone having to order them to. Caleb was very still. How do you know that? He asked. I keep my kitchen window open, she said simply. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that she was starting to recognize, a kind of wondering that he didn't quite know what to do with, from a man who had spent years dealing in certainties. Miss Holloway, he said. Mr. Whitaker, what exactly do you think you're doing on this ranch? Margaret considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. My job, she said. Same as always. He left without quite resolving the thing she'd said, which was exactly what she'd intended. The trouble, when it came in earnest, didn't announce itself. It never did. 3 weeks into her time at Whitaker Ranch, a man arrived at the front gate on a gray horse, with a leather saddlebag that looked expensive and a smile that looked like work. Margaret saw him from the kitchen window, not that she was looking for anything in particular. She simply had a habit of knowing who came and went on the property. She'd developed that habit young and never found a reason to break it. The man's name, she would learn before supper, was Silas Draper. He was a land agent out of Helena, and he had come, supposedly, to discuss a business arrangement with Caleb regarding some eastern acreage that abutted the Whitaker property. She heard his name passed between 2 cowboys near the well, heard the way they said it careful, the way it's a name of something they're not sure is safe to touch. She didn't ask questions, she listened. By nightfall, she had a partial picture. Draper had been to the ranch once before, 6 months ago, when things were still bad, before the supply lines had stabilized, before the men had stopped threatening to leave in groups of 3 and 4. He'd made an offer for the eastern acreage then, and Caleb had sent him away. Now he was back. She made a point of seeing his face at supper. He sat at the main table by Caleb's invitation, she could see that much. The way a host positions a guest, and he ate her food with the mechanical efficiency of a man who registers taste only as confirmation that what he put in his mouth was in fact food. He talked while he chewed, which Margaret found rude, and he laughed at things that weren't funny, which she found worse. But it was the way he looked around the room that she kept coming back to. He was cataloging. She recognized the look she'd worn it herself, walking into strange kitchens in strange places, assessing what was there and what it was worth. Except she did that to figure out how to help. The way Draper did it was different. He was counting assets, measuring weakness. Henry Dawson sat 3 seats down from Draper, and Margaret watched the old man the same way she watched a pot on the stove waiting for the first sign of a boil. Henry had lived on this land longer than most of the other hands, and he had the particular stillness of a man choosing to hold his tongue very deliberately. After supper, when the hall was clearing and she was beginning the cleanup, Henry came to the pass-through window. He set his cup down and looked at her with the quiet precision of a man selecting his words one at a time. "You see the man Caleb brought to the table tonight?" he asked. "I saw him," Margaret said. "You know who he is?" "Land agent." "Helena. Name's Draper. He was here 6 months ago." Henry's eyebrows rose slightly. "You do your homework." "I keep my ears open," she said. "Same principle." She kept stacking plates. "What do you know about him?" Henry was quiet for a beat. "Last time he was here he had papers with him, showing the eastern acreage was worth less than half what Caleb paid for it. Caleb sent him packing." He paused. "Those papers were wrong." "I know it. Most of us know it. That land has the best water access on the property." Margaret stopped stacking. "And now he's back," she said. "And now he's back," Henry agreed, with a bigger smile and a heavier saddlebag. She looked at the old man's face. The worry there was real, not the abstract worry of a hired hand about his employer's finances, but the specific fear of a man who understood exactly what would happen to 42 people if the wrong land was signed away to the wrong person. "Does Caleb know what that land is worth?" she asked. "Caleb knows cattle," Henry said. "He knows land in the way a rancher knows it. He doesn't know the water law the way a land agent does." "And Draper does. Draper knows exactly what he's doing," Henry said. "That's the problem." Margaret nodded slowly. She went back to her plates. "Thank you, Henry," she said. "I'm not sure what I've thanked you for," he said. "For telling me what I needed to know," she said. He studied her for a moment. "What are you going to do with it?" "Nothing yet," she said. "I'm going to think about it first. Thinking before doing is a habit I recommend highly." Henry Dawson almost smiled. "You remind me of my grandmother," he said. "She was a formidable woman." "I'll take that as the compliment I'm sure you mean it to be," Margaret said. He touched the brim of his hat and walked away. She finished the cleanup in silence, and she thought. Draper stayed 3 days. She watched him those 3 days the way she watched weather, not anxiously, but with attention, because what you noticed in the early signs was what prepared you for what was coming. He ate his meals with Caleb at the main table, away from the Cowboys, and she could hear the shape of their conversations even when she couldn't make out the words, the rhythms of a man doing the specific work of persuasion, the long pauses, the sudden laughter, the even longer pauses after the laughter. Caleb was listening. She could see it in the way he sat during those meals, forward in his chair, elbows on the table, hat off, which she'd come to understand meant he was paying full attention to something. He wasn't agreeing, not yet, but he was listening more than she wanted him to. On the second night, she made Draper's coffee a half-degree too cool. Not cold, not obviously wrong, just not quite right. The kind of thing a particular kind of man notices and doesn't mention, but doesn't forget. On the third morning, she overheard through the kitchen window, in the space between his words and the wind, Draper say to Caleb, "The thing is, you're holding on to a piece of ground that's costing you more than it's giving back. I can give you a price that lets you reinvest in the parts of this operation that are actually working." And she heard Caleb say, slower and more careful than Draper probably expected, "I'd want to think on it." That was the morning she decided she needed to know more than Henry had been able to tell her. She sent a letter with Earl on the supply run addressed to a woman named Clara Simmons, who ran the post office in Bitter Creek and who had, in Margaret's brief time in town, struck her as the kind of woman who made it her personal business to know everything worth knowing. Margaret had made Clara a gift of a jar of her apple butter before leaving town, which she suspected would be remembered. She asked Clara, in plain language, to find out what she could about Silas Draper and his business dealings in the territory, and to send word back with Earl on the next run. Then she went back to her kitchen and she cooked, because that was what she could do, and it was not nothing. On the morning of Draper's third day, before he saddled his horse to leave, he stopped at the kitchen pass-through window. It was the first time he'd done so. He'd eaten at the main table every meal, served separately, and she'd made a point of not seeking him out. He looked at her the way she'd watched him, look at the ranch, calculating, cataloging, assessing value. "You make a fine table, miss," he started. "Holloway," she said. "Miss Holloway." He smiled. It was a good smile. She would admit that, practiced and pleasant and utterly without warmth. "You've done something remarkable here in a short time." The men seemed settled, happy even. "They're fed," she said. "Fed people are easier to be around." "Quite." He tilted his head slightly. "How long have you been here? 3 weeks? Close enough." "And before this you were in Bitter Creek?" "For a time," she said, keeping her tone pleasant and her information minimal. He nodded as if she'd told him something useful. "Well, I hope things continue to go well for you. This ranch has a lot of potential. With the right decisions, it could be something significant." "It already is something significant," Margaret said. "Mr. Whitaker just needs to be reminded of that occasionally." Draper's smile sharpened slightly. "Yes, I suppose he does." He tipped his hat and walked away. She watched him go with the particular stillness of a woman who has decided something and is keeping it very close until the right moment. Caleb came to find her before noon. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands the way he always did, and he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not calculating, not uncertain, something heavier. "He made me an offer," he said. Margaret kept her hands moving. She was rolling biscuit dough, and she did not stop. "I know." Caleb blinked. "You know. I know he's been working toward an offer since he rode in," she said. "I know the eastern acreage is involved. I know he was here 6 months ago with paperwork that undervalued your water access, and I know you sent him away then." She looked up. "I know you're thinking about not sending him away this time." The silence in the kitchen was very specific, the kind that comes when a person realizes they've been seen more clearly than they expected. "How?" Caleb said, and then stopped, and then, "Henry." "Henry told me what he knew," she said, "which was less than I needed. I found the rest on my own. You've been here 3 weeks." "I've been paying attention for 3 weeks," she said. "There's a difference." He walked into the kitchen, then fully in, not just the doorway, and stood at the edge of the counter. His jaw was tight and his eyes were doing the thing where he was working through something complicated and not enjoying the process. "He's offering good money," Caleb said. "He's offering what he wants you to think is good money," Margaret said. "Those are different things. You don't know what the land is worth." "I know what water access is worth," she said. "And I know that a man doesn't ride 12 miles twice in 6 months to make an honest offer. He rides that far to correct the fact that the first dishonest one didn't work." Caleb stared at her. She cut the biscuits, laid them in the pan. Kept going. "Miss Holloway," he said finally, with respect. "You're a cook." The words landed flat and blunt. She heard the shape of them, not cruel exactly, but the kind of thing a man says when he's feeling crowded and needs to re-establish something. She set the biscuit cutter down. She looked at him without any performance in it. No anger, no hurt, just steady and straight. "You're right," she said. "I'm a cook. I'm also a woman who has spent 15 years managing household finances for people who thought I couldn't understand them. And 3 of those years I spent in a town where a land agent ran a scheme that cost 6 families everything they had." She paused. "I know what this looks like, because I've seen what it leaves behind." The kitchen was completely quiet. Caleb's expression had changed entirely. The tightness was still there, but the dismissal was gone, replaced by something open and raw and paying close attention. You never told me any of that, he said. You never asked, she said. And you weren't ready to hear it until right now. He put his hat on the counter. That was new. He always held it. Putting it down meant he was staying. Tell me what you know, he said. All of it. So she told him. She told him what Henry had said about the first visit and the falsified valuation. She told him what she'd observed about the way Draper moved through a room. She told him about the letter she'd sent to Clara Sismons and the fact that she was waiting for a response. She told him, plainly, that she thought Draper had information about the water rights on the eastern acreage that he was deliberately withholding because disclosing it would make his offer look like exactly what it was, a theft dressed up as a favor. Caleb listened. Really listened, not waiting for her to finish so he could speak, but taking in what she said and turning it over and considering it the way a man considers something he's going to have to live with. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. I was going to agree to his terms, he said. Not today, but I was thinking about it. I know, she said. You just talked me out of it. I gave you information, she said. You talked yourself out of it. He picked his hat back up off the counter. He turned it in his hands, that familiar gesture, except right now it looked less like a habit and more like a man steadying himself. Why, he said, why does it matter to you? Margaret thought about that. She looked at her biscuits in the pan and thought about 42 men who had started eating better and sleeping easier and laughing like people who remembered how. She thought about Henry Dawson and the apple pie and the way a room could change when you gave people back the thing they'd forgotten they deserved. Because everything I've built in this kitchen since I walked through your gate, she said quietly, depends on this ranch still being standing. She meant it practically. She also meant it in ways she wasn't ready to say out loud. Caleb heard both. She could tell by the way he went still, and the way the air in the kitchen changed the way it had on that first Sunday when Henry had laughed and the room had finally taken a breath. I'll wait for the letter from Bitter Creek, Caleb said. Before I give him any answer. That's all I'm asking, Margaret said. He nodded. Turn to go, Mr. Whitaker. He stopped in the doorway. Old habit. The biscuits will be done in 20 minutes, she said. If you haven't eaten yet. He hadn't. She could tell by the fact that he'd been standing in her kitchen at noon holding his hat instead of sitting at the table with his men. He sat down at the small work table in the corner of the kitchen, the one she used for her prep work, and he waited for the biscuits. She set a plate in front of him without ceremony. He ate. She worked beside him in silence, and neither of them said anything else. And it was the most natural thing that had happened on the Whitaker Ranch, in as long as either of them could remember. By the time Earl brought the next supply run out 3 days later, there was a letter in his coat pocket from Clara Sismons in Bitter Creek. Margaret read it in the kitchen before the breakfast rush, standing alone in the early light with flour still on her hands, and when she finished reading, she set it down on the counter and was quiet for a moment. Then she went to find Caleb. She found him in the yard, talking to his foreman, a solid and taciturn man named Getz, who's approximately 4 words an hour, but all of them tended to count. She waited until Price had moved off before she walked over. She held out the letter. Caleb took it. Read it again. His jaw went very tight. He filed a water rights claim, Caleb said. His voice was flat in a way she had learned to recognize as a man holding something very hot very carefully. On the eastern acreage, 6 weeks ago, before he ever rode out here to make his offer. Before he rode out here the second time, Margaret said. He filed it before his first visit, too. Clara found 2 filings. The first one was incomplete. It would have given him a partial claim. The one from 6 weeks ago is complete. If you sell him that land, the water rights transfer with it. And the water rights on that parcel feed the northern pasture. Caleb looked up from the letter. If I lose the northern pasture water, he said slowly, I lose the northern pasture. And without the northern pasture, Margaret said, I lose half my grazing capacity. He stopped. His eyes went somewhere far away for a moment, the particular distance of a man seeing what almost happened, and then came back. "I was going to sign those papers." "You didn't," she said. "I was going to," he said again, like the weight of it needed to be said twice. "You didn't," Margaret said again, same tone. Steady. Final. Moving forward, he looked at her. In 3 weeks on this ranch, she had fed his men back to life, seen through a con that would have cost him half his operation, and done all of it without asking for anything other than flour and dried apples and a working stove. He opened his mouth, he closed it. He looked down at the letter in his hands, and then back up at her, and there was something in his face right then that he hadn't planned to put there and that she hadn't planned to see. She took a step back. "You should send a letter to your lawyer in Helena," she said, "before Draper has time to move further on that filing." "Yes," Caleb said, pulling himself back to practical. "Yes, I'll do that today." "Good." She turned back toward the kitchen. "Miss Holloway." "Thank you," he said. "I mean it. What you did finding that out, you didn't have to." "No," she agreed, "I didn't." She went back to her kitchen. She went back to her bread. But her hands, which had been perfectly steady through all of it, through Webb and Draper and the letter, and Caleb's face in the yard, her hands, for just a moment, were not quite as steady as they usually were. She pressed them flat against the counter and waited. Then she began again. The letter to Caleb's lawyer in Helena went out the same afternoon, tucked into Earl's coat pocket, alongside the empty supply crates and a list of things needed for next week's kitchen run. Margaret watched the wagon pull away from the gate and felt something loosen slightly in her chest, not relief exactly, but the particular exhale of a person who has done what they can and must now wait on the world to catch up. Waiting was not her strongest skill. She went back to her kitchen and started on supper. The days that followed were quiet, in the way that weather is quiet before it decides what it wants to do. The men ate well, worked hard, and the easy rhythm that had begun to develop on the ranch continued to build slowly, the way a fire catches when you've finally got the wood dry enough and the kindling laid right. Henry Dawson had taken to arriving 15 minutes before the other men each morning, not to eat early, but simply to sit at the far end of the table with his coffee and be the first voice the others heard when they came through the door. She hadn't asked him to do that. He'd simply started doing it, the way people with good instincts often do the right thing before they've consciously decided to. Connors had stopped following Webb's lead, which she'd noticed before Webb himself seemed to. Webb, for his part, had gone quieter. Not warm, she wasn't expecting warm from him anytime soon, but quieter. He came to meals. He ate, he left without incident. Once she caught him helping one of the younger hands fix a stuck wagon wheel in the yard. And the way he did it efficient, without making the younger man feel stupid about needing help, told her something about who he was, beneath all that bristle and provocation. She didn't say anything about it, but she made sure his plate was always full. Garrett Price, the foreman, came to her on a Wednesday morning with a problem she hadn't anticipated. He stood at the kitchen door with his hat already off a sign. She had learned that he was about to say something he'd been building toward for a while, and he looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has decided to trust someone and is hoping that decision doesn't end badly. "There's a family," he said, "homesteaders, about 4 miles east. The Breckenridges. Father, mother, 3 young ones. They're in a bad way." Margaret put her spoon down. "What kind of bad way?" "The father got hurt last month. Can't work. They've been getting by on what they had stored, but it's running thin. The mother came to the gate yesterday, while you were at the stove." He paused. She didn't ask for anything. She came to the gate and stood there for a while, and then she went away. Margaret was very still. "And you're telling me," she said, "because you didn't know what to do with it." "I'm telling you," Price said, "because I figured you might." She looked at him for a moment. 4 words an hour, she had thought when she first came to the ranch. But the 4 words Price chose were never wasted. "Can you spare a man and a wagon on Saturday morning?" she asked. I can spare two, he said. One is enough, she said. I'll need to put together a box. Flour, dried beans, salt, pork. Cornmeal. Whatever I can manage without stripping the pantry. Price nodded. He put his hat back on. Price, she said. He stopped. You did a good thing, coming to tell me. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was almost startled. Just seemed like the right thing, he said. Most people know what the right thing is, Margaret said. The difference is whether they do it. He walked back to the yard without another word, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him go, and felt something settle more deeply into the foundation of what she was building here, because that was what this was now, she understood. A foundation, not just meals, not just a kitchen, something that other people were starting to add to without being asked. She began putting together the box for the Breckenridges that same afternoon. Caleb found out about it on Friday, which was one day sooner than she'd expected. He came to the kitchen in the late afternoon while she was organizing the supply box, and he stood in the doorway hat in hands, as always, and looked at what she was doing and said nothing for a moment. Price told me, he said. I assumed he would. You could have asked me first. I could have, she agreed. She kept working. Would you have said no? He was quiet. No, he finally said. Then I saved us both a conversation, she said, though she kept her tone easy so it didn't land as a dismissal. She looked up. If it bothers you that I acted without asking, tell me. I'll ask next time. He turned his hat in his hands. The gesture was becoming familiar to her in ways she was careful not to think about too directly. It doesn't bother me, he said. I didn't know about the Breckenridges. I know, she said gently. That's why Price came to me instead of you. He knew I'd know what to do with it. Something moved across Caleb's face. Not wounded, but the particular look of a man realizing that his own operation has been quietly working around him in ways that are not criticisms so much as adaptations. Like finding out the river has changed course without you noticing because you weren't looking at the river. I should have known about them, he said. Yes, she agreed. Honest, but not unkind, you should have. But you know now. He looked at the box she was packing. He reached past her, without saying anything, and added 2 cans of tomatoes that were sitting on the shelf above the counter. She looked at his hands, then at him. He looked back at her steadily. For the Breckenridges, he said. For the Breckenridges, she said. They stood there a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then Margaret shifted her attention back to the box, and Caleb shifted his to somewhere near the window. And neither of them said anything about what had just passed between them in the silence. The response from the lawyer in Helena arrived on a Friday evening, and it hit the Whitaker ranch like a stone dropped into still water. Margaret was finishing the supper cleanup when she heard Caleb's boots on the kitchen porch, not the usual measured pace, but something faster, with a weight to it that made her set down her rag and turn before he'd even reached the door. He came in with the letter already open in his hand, and his face had that specific look she had only seen once before, on a man who had just realized how close he'd come to something he couldn't undo. The water rights filing is real, he said. Draper filed them under a proxy name. A business out of Helena that he controls through a third party. My lawyer found the connection, but it took him 3 days of looking. He stopped. He looked at the letter, then at her. If I had signed those papers the day he asked me to, I would have transferred the land and every legal claim attached to it. By the time I'd figured out what happened, it would have been too late to contest. Margaret said nothing. She waited. He's done it before, Caleb continued. His voice had gone flat and precise in the way of a man who is being very careful not to let what he's feeling get ahead of what he's saying. My lawyer found 2 other ranchers, both smaller operations. Both sold eastern parcels in the last 18 months. Both lost water access within 6 months of selling. He set the letter on the counter. One of them had to sell the rest of the property. The other one is still fighting it in territorial court. The kitchen was very quiet. What does your lawyer recommend? Margaret asked. He's filing a counterclaim on the water rights, first thing Monday. He says we have strong standing because Draper's proxy company filed on land they had no title interest in at the time that's improper, possibly fraudulent. Caleb's jaw tightened. He also says the Territorial Marshal's office should be informed. Good, Margaret said. All of that is good. Caleb looked at her. This is because of the letter you sent to Clara Simmons. This is because Henry Dawson noticed something wrong and told me about it, she said. And because Clara Simmons knows more about what goes on in this territory than most men give her credit for. And because your lawyer is thorough. All of those things together. And because you connected them, Caleb said. She didn't answer that. Not because it wasn't true, but because the way he said it, low and direct and with something underneath the words that had nothing to do with business, made her feel the need to be careful. Will you be all right? She asked instead. The counterclaim, the cost of it. I'll manage, he said. He paused. The ranch is in better shape than it was 6 weeks ago. You know that. She did know it. She'd been watching the numbers in the way she watched everything quietly. From the edges, and she knew that the savings from reduced food waste and better supply management, and fewer men leaving and needing to be replaced, had already added up to something meaningful. She hadn't said anything about it, because it wasn't her place to say it. Good, she said. Caleb picked up the letter, folded it, put it back in his pocket. He didn't move toward the door. She picked up her rag and went back to the counter she'd been cleaning when he came in. Miss Holloway, he said. Mr. Whitaker, I need to say something, and I'm not sure I'm going to say it right. She stopped moving. She kept her back to him for one moment, just one, and then she turned around and looked at him with the same openness she'd given him every time he needed it. He looked, for just a moment, like a man standing at the edge of something he wasn't sure he should step off. When I ran that advertisement, he said slowly, I was trying to solve a practical problem. I needed someone who could feed my men and keep this kitchen running. That was all I was thinking about. He stopped. I wasn't expecting someone who would do everything you've done. The Breckenridges, the supply system, what you caught with Draper. Another pause. What you did to this place. To the men. He stopped again. She waited. To me, he said finally, quietly. The kitchen held its breath. Margaret looked at him. She looked at the crease between his brows, the set of his jaw, the hands that held the hat with a grip that was not quite steady, and she understood clearly. As she understood most things that were placed plainly in front of her what he was trying to say and why he was finding it so difficult. She also understood what was at stake if this conversation went in a direction neither of them had planned. She was careful. You hired a cook, she said. Her voice was quiet and even. I'm glad the job has been useful. He blinked. Something in his expression flickered recognition that she had just offered him a door marked practical matters and that she had done it on purpose. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Good night, Miss Holloway, he said. Good night, Mr. Whitaker, she said. He left. She stood in the kitchen alone and breathed. She was not unaffected. She was also not unwise. There was a significant distance between those two things. And she intended to stay in that distance for as long as it took to know for certain which direction things were actually moving, rather than which direction they felt like moving in a warm kitchen on a difficult evening. She went back to cleaning. The counter was already clean. She cleaned it again. 3 days later, the storm came. It was the kind of storm that the Montana Territory produced with a particular savagery in the late season, fast-moving and brutal. The sort that old hands could feel in their joints a half-day ahead of time, and that caught everyone else completely by surprise. Henry Dawson had mentioned something at breakfast that morning about the sky looking wrong, using the specific tone of a man whose body has been a weather instrument for 50 years and doesn't need to read any other signs. Margaret had listened. She'd started doubling the afternoon's bread supply before noon. By 3 o'clock the wind had come up hard, and by 4 the rain was coming sideways, and by 5 the yard was a disaster of equipment that hadn't been secured in time, and men running in 3 directions trying to manage what could still be managed. She kept the stoves burning. She kept the coffee hot. She sent one of the kitchen's youngest helpers, a boy of about 16 named Thomas, who had recently attached himself to her kitchen operation, with the particular devotion of someone who has discovered a calling out to the bunkhouse 3 times. With covered pots, because she knew that men working in bad weather needed hot food, the same way a fire needs oxygen, and she wasn't going to wait for them to come to her. Thomas came back the 3rd time with his coat soaked through and his eyes bright with the specific excitement of young people in crises. "Mr. Whitaker's out in the north pasture," he said, wiping water off his face. "Part of the fence line came down. He and Price and 4 others are trying to hold the cattle in." "Is anyone?" Thomas said. "Go get dry," she said. "There's soup on the back burner. Eat something." "Yes, ma'am." She kept cooking. At 7:30, the men started coming in from the storm in groups of 2 and 3, soaked and exhausted, and moving with the heavy deliberateness of bodies that have pushed past comfortable limits. She fed each one as they came. Soup first, then bread, then whatever she could add to the plate to put more heat into them. Nobody argued about portions. Nobody had anything left over to complain with. Webb came in near the end of the group, his shoulder bleeding through a torn sleeve from where something had caught him in the dark. He sat down at the table and looked at the food in front of him, and then looked up at Margaret, who had come around to the dining hall side with a clean cloth and the small medical kit she kept in the kitchen cabinet. She didn't ask. She just sat down across from him and held out her hand for his arm. He hesitated. "Webb," she said, not unkindly, "let me look at it." He gave her his arm. She cleaned the cut. It was shallow, which was lucky, and wrapped it with practiced efficiency. He watched her hands the whole time with an expression she couldn't quite read until he finally said, very quietly, without any of his usual edge, "Why do you do all this?" She tied off the bandage. "Do what?" "All of it." He gestured vaguely toward the kitchen, toward the food, toward the ranch in general. "You don't have to. Nobody would say anything if you just cooked. Did the job. Went to bed. You do everything else on top of it, and nobody even asked you to." Margaret sat back and looked at him. In the weeks since he'd pushed into her kitchen with his thumbs in his belt and his cruelty all sharpened up and ready, she had watched him change in ways that she suspected he didn't realize were visible. The meanness had been coming off him slowly, the way frost comes off a surface when the morning warms up, not all at once, but consistently, in the direction of something better underneath. "Because it matters," she said simply. "The whole of it matters. The food, yes, but also whether the men are all right. Whether the Breckenridges have enough to get through to spring. Whether the right information gets to the right person before damage gets done that can't be undone." She paused. "I don't know how to do a job halfway. Never have." Webb looked at his wrapped arm. "I was rotten to you when you got here," he said. "You were," she agreed. "Matter of fact, no performance of forgiveness required." "I'm sorry," he said. And it landed the way a real apology lands, direct and without decoration, the kind that has been turning over inside someone for long enough to come out smooth. "I know," she said. She stood up. "Eat your soup before it gets cold." He picked up his spoon. She went back to the kitchen. Thomas was at the stove, stirring without being asked. She looked at him, his still damp hair, his earnest face, the way he'd positioned himself to be useful, and thought about the particular gift of young people who are in the right place at exactly the right time. "Thomas," she said, "you did good today." He looked up with the full brightness of 16 years old being seen clearly by an adult. "Yes, ma'am," and smiled. Caleb came in last. She heard the door, heard the particular weight of his step heavier than usual. Slower, and looked up from the bread she was cutting, to see him standing just inside the kitchen door with mud on his coat and a cut along the side of his jaw she hadn't noticed in the dark, and something exhausted in every line of him that went deeper than the storm. She said nothing. She filled a bowl of soup. She put bread beside it. She set it on the small work table in the corner, the same work table where he had sat and waited for biscuits, weeks ago, the first time he had stayed, and she pulled out the chair. He sat down, he ate, she worked. When he'd been sitting there a few minutes in silence, he said, without looking up, "The fence line is holding. We lost about 30 head off to the eastern range, but Price thinks we can recover most of them tomorrow when it clears." "Good," she said. "Thomas told me you sent food out 3 times during the storm." The men were working in the cold. He was quiet. "I saw the Connors boy," he started. "Sitting with Dawson," she said. "I know. They've been doing that." Another quiet. "You see everything," he said. "I see what's in front of me," she said. "Most people do, if they slow down enough to look." He set his spoon down. He was looking at the cut on his jaw, which was still oozing slightly, though he didn't seem to have noticed. She got the medical kit without asking. She sat down across from him at the small work table. He looked at her surprised, then something softer, and held very still while she cleaned the cut on his jaw. The kitchen was quiet around them, everyone else in the dining hall or back at the bunkhouse, and the storm still moving against the windows, and Margaret working with her usual steady precision, close enough that she was aware of every breath in the room. He was also very still, not the stillness of discomfort. The other kind. She finished, sat back, put the cloth in the kit. "Thank you," he said. Very quiet, she met his eyes. This time she did not offer him the door marked "Practical Matters." She didn't offer him anything. She just looked back at him honestly, the way she tried to look at everything, and let the moment be what it was for exactly 3 seconds before she stood up and returned to her counter. Her hands were not as steady as she intended. She pressed them flat on the cool wood and waited for them to settle. The storm was still going outside, rattling the window she always kept cracked during cooking hours, and the kitchen smelled like soup and bread and wood smoke. And Caleb Whitaker sat at the small table in the corner, finishing his meal without speaking. And Margaret Holloway stood at her counter and understood with the same practical clarity she brought to every problem she'd ever faced that the thing she'd been careful not to feel had been slowly refusing to cooperate with her caution. She understood it. She filed it away. She started the next day's bread. But the morning after the storm brought something that none of them had seen coming, and by the time the sun was fully up over the Montana Territory, the careful thing Margaret had built over the previous weeks was about to be tested in ways she hadn't prepared for. She was carrying a water pail from the yard when she heard the voices near the front gate, 3 of them, men she didn't recognize, one of them on horseback and talking with a loud, carrying certainty that reminded her immediately of Silas Draper, though this was not Draper's voice. She set the pail down. She listened. The man on horseback was talking to Price, who had come out to meet them with his arms crossed and his face closed. She couldn't hear the words clearly from where she stood, but she could read the shape of the conversation, the way Price's posture got incrementally stiffer with each exchange, the way the man on the horse kept gesturing toward the eastern part of the property with the proprietary confidence of someone pointing at something he has already decided belongs to him. Then Price turned and looked toward the house, and then he looked toward the kitchen. And something in his expression, even from that distance, made Margaret's stomach drop. She went inside. She found Caleb in the main house already pulling on his coat. "Who is that?" she asked. He looked at her. His face was the controlled, careful kind of blank that she had come to understand meant the opposite of blank. "His name is Roy Draper," he said. She went very still. "Silas Draper's older brother," Caleb said, "and he is apparently in possession of a signed agreement that he claims my father made with his family 15 years ago. Regarding the eastern acreage." He paused. "He says the water rights were promised to the Draper family in perpetuity." "In writing." Margaret heard herself say, "Is there such an agreement?" "I don't know," Caleb said. "My father kept records, but they weren't well organized. I inherited this ranch, and I inherited the filing system," which is he stopped. "I haven't looked at everything. You need to look at everything," she said. "Right now." before you say a single word to that man at your gate." He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man who has stopped being surprised that she's right and started simply acting on it. "The study," he said. "I have boxes. I've never fully gone through my father's papers." "I'll help you," she said. "Send Price to keep him occupied." And Caleb, she rarely used his given name. She'd done it without deciding to, and they both noticed. "Don't go to that gate until we know what we're dealing with." He held her gaze. "All right," he said. They went to the study. And in the second box they opened, behind a deed for a neighboring property and a stack of old cattle records, Margaret's hands found a folded piece of paper with a watermark across the corner and handwriting she didn't recognize and a date that was 15 years old. She unfolded it slowly. She read it. And the thing she read made the entire situation suddenly and completely clear, not in the way that resolved anything, but in the way that reveals the full size of the problem you are actually dealing with. She looked up at Caleb. He had been watching her face. "What does it say?" he said. She handed it to him and watched him read it, and watched his expression go through 3 different things in the time it took him to reach the bottom of the page. "This isn't what he's claiming it is," Caleb said. His voice was very controlled. "This is a letter of intent. It's not a binding agreement. My father was considering a water-sharing arrangement, not a transfer of rights." "I know," Margaret said. "But Roy Draper is standing at your gate with a version of that document that he has almost certainly had someone alter." Caleb looked at her. "Then we need my lawyer," he said. "We need your lawyer," she said. "And we need to find out exactly what version of that document Roy Draper is carrying before he gets an opportunity to do anything official with it." She stood. "Henry Dawson was on this ranch 15 years ago. He might remember what your father was actually negotiating with the Draper family." Caleb had already moved to the door. "Henry," he said. "Henry," she confirmed. They found him at the fence line, and when Caleb told him what was at the gate and what document had been found and what Roy Draper was claiming, Henry Dawson stood very still for exactly 4 seconds and then said something that none of them had been expecting. "Your father never signed anything with the Drapers," he said. "I was in the room. I know for certain he never signed it, because the negotiation fell apart the same week, and I helped your father write the letter declining the arrangement." He looked at Caleb. "If Roy Draper has a signature on that document, it isn't your father's." The Montana Territory air sat between the 3 of them. Margaret looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Henry. And then Caleb Whitaker turned and walked back toward the front gate with the measured, deliberate pace of a man who knows exactly where he is going and is no longer uncertain about anything at all. Caleb walked to that gate like a man who had finally remembered who he was. Margaret followed at a distance, not because she was afraid, but because she understood that this moment belonged to him. She had given him the information. Henry had given him the certainty. What happened at the gate was Caleb's to carry. Roy Draper was a bigger man than his brother, broader through the chest, with a face that had spent more time outdoors and less time perfecting a pleasant expression. He sat his horse with the ease of someone accustomed to being the most significant person in any given yard, and he watched Caleb approach with the particular patience of a man who believes he is holding all the cards. "Whitaker," he said, "glad you came out. I was beginning to think I'd have to come in." "You wouldn't have gotten past the gate," Caleb said. His voice was level, completely level. Margaret, standing near the fence post with her arms crossed, marked that levelness as the specific sound of a man who has moved past angry into something colder and more useful. Roy Draper smiled. "No need for hostility. I'm here on a legal matter." "A straightforward one. Show me the document," Caleb said. Draper reached into his saddlebag with the unhurried confidence of a man producing something he's certain will end the conversation. He held out a folded set of papers. Caleb took them. He unfolded them. He read them without expression. Margaret watched his hands. They were perfectly still. "This document carries my father's signature," Caleb said. "It does," Draper said. "My father never signed this agreement." Draper's smile didn't move. I understand that's a difficult thing to hear. But the signature has already been verified by a notary in Helena. By which notary? Caleb asked. A beat brief, but Margaret caught it. A reputable office, Draper said. I can provide the name. You'll provide it to my lawyer, Caleb said, who I have already been in contact with regarding your brother's fraudulent water rights filing. The same lawyer who will now be receiving this document for forensic examination. He folded the papers and held them out. I'll be keeping a copy. You can have the original back, since you'll need it for the territorial court proceedings. Draper's smile finally shifted. Not gone men like him didn't let expressions just fall off their faces but reorganized into something less certain of itself. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said. You came to my ranch with a forged document, Caleb said. I'm making it exactly as hard as it needs to be. Henry Dawson had come to stand near Margaret without her noticing, moving with the quiet of an old man who knows when his presence is needed without being asked. She felt him beside her, solid and still, watching the gate with the expression of someone who has waited a long time for this particular moment. I was in the room, Henry said, loud enough for Draper to hear clearly. The night your family tried to negotiate that arrangement with Frank Whitaker. I helped Frank write the letter declining the offer. There is no signature because there was no agreement. Whatever that paper says, it's a lie. Roy Draper looked at Henry for a long moment. Then he looked at Caleb. Then he looked briefly, past Caleb, and his gaze landed on Margaret for just a second before he pulled it away. That 1 second was enough. She saw the calculation in it, the rapid reassessment of a man who had arrived expecting easy resistance and was recalibrating in real time. This isn't over, Draper said. He kept his voice smooth, which cost him something. She could see the cost of it, in the tightening at the corners of his jaw. I know, Caleb said. I'll see you in territorial court. Draper turned his horse. His 2 men followed without a word. Margaret watched them ride until they were past the first turn in the road and out of sight. The yard was very quiet. Around her, she was gradually aware of the presence of men cowboys who had found reasons to be near the fence, near the barn, near any position with a clear view of the gate. Nobody had been asked to come. They had simply drifted into position, the way men do when they understand something important is happening, and they want their bodies to be counted on the right side of it. Caleb turned around. He looked at his men, all of them, the full scatter of them arranged across the yard, and something moved across his face that she had no good word for. Not quite pride, something older and quieter than pride. Price stepped forward. What do you need? I need someone to ride to the telegraph office in Bitter Creek, Caleb said. Today, I need a message sent to my lawyer in Helena. I need him on the next available stage. I'll go, Connors said. He was already moving toward the barn before Caleb could confirm it. Connors. Caleb's voice stopped him. Thank you. Connors looked back. He nodded once, and in that nod Margaret saw 6 weeks of slow change complete itself. The boy who had laughed at her on the first day, who had been Webb's shadow and Draper's unwitting audience, standing in the yard like someone who had decided, perhaps without realizing it, to become a different kind of man. She went back to the kitchen. She had bread proving. She had a noon meal to produce. The ranch still needed feeding, regardless of what was happening at the gate or what was heading toward them from Helena. Thomas was at the stove when she came in, stirring without being asked, which was becoming his signature move. He looked at her face and didn't say anything for once, which told her he was learning. Keep that going, she said. I'm going to start on the biscuits. Yes, ma'am. She worked. The kitchen was the one place in the world where she had never once doubted herself, and she leaned into that certainty the way you lean into a wind that's coming from behind. Let it carry you. Let it do something useful with all that force. The lawyer arrived from Helena on a Wednesday. His name was Arthur Bemis, a small Precise man with a leather case that never left his left hand, and the specific manner of someone who has spent 30 years being underestimated and has built a very comfortable life on the gap up between what people expected of him and what he actually delivered. He came to the kitchen the first evening, which surprised her. He stood in the doorway with the leather case still in his hand and said, "You're Miss Holloway." "I am," she said. "Caleb told me I should talk to you before I talk to almost anyone else." He looked around the kitchen with the same assessing intelligence he probably brought to legal documents. He said, "You're the one who found the water rights, filing through a contact in Bitter Creek." "Clara Simmons found it," Margaret said. "I just asked the right question." Bemis smiled, small and precise like everything else about him. "In my experience, asking the right question is the harder part." He sat down at the small work table without being invited, which she decided to interpret as efficiency rather than presumption. "Tell me everything you observed about both Draper brothers." From the beginning, she told him. She was thorough. She told him about Silas's first visit and the things she'd noticed, the way he cataloged the room, the falsified valuation that Henriette had described, the specific timing of his second approach. She told him about the letter from Clara and what it had revealed about the proxy company and the prior water rights filings in other parts of the territory. She told him about Roy's arrival, the document, the forged signature, and the particular way Roy's eyes had moved when Henry called him out. Bemis listened with his hands folded on the table and his eyes doing the kind of rapid processing that looked like stillness but wasn't. When she finished, he said, "You noticed the moment his certainty broke." When Henry spoke, she said, "Yes, that tells me something about how confident he was in the forgery," Bemis said. "A man who believes his evidence is unassailable doesn't react when it's challenged." "He reacted. He recalculated," Margaret said. "He looked at me before he pulled his expression back together. He was figuring out how much we knew." Bemis looked at her with clear and direct appreciation. "Miss Holloway, I have worked with witnesses for 30 years. You have just given me a more precise account of the relevant details of this situation than most trained observers would manage." He paused. "How did you come to have such particular attention to these things?" Margaret considered the question. "I've spent my whole life in other people's households," she said. "You learn to read rooms quickly when you don't have the luxury of being wrong about them." Bemis was quiet for a moment. Then he opened his leather case. "All right," he said. "Let me show you what I've found so far, and you can tell me if any of it lines up with what you observed." They worked together at the small work table for 2 hours, while the evening settled around the ranch and the kitchen cooled, and Thomas quietly brought them both coffee and had the remarkable good sense to leave again immediately after. What Bemis had found was a pattern meticulous and ugly. The Draper brothers had been operating together for at least 5 years, using a rotating set of proxy companies and a network of cooperative notaries spread across 3 territorial counties. Silas came first, made the offer, assessed the resistance. If the rancher was close to agreeing, Silas closed it. If the rancher resisted, Roy appeared with the forged historical claim pressure from another angle, the kind designed to make a man feel that fighting was too expensive and too complicated and too exhausting, so he might as well just settle. 2 other ranchers had settled. One had lost his northern pasture. The other had lost everything. "We need both of them," Margaret said. The other ranchers. "If this goes to territorial court, their experience corroborates the pattern." "Agreed," Bemis said. "I've already written to both. One of them is willing to testify. The other one isn't." "The other one is afraid," Bemis said simply. "He lost his operation. He's starting over somewhere else, and he doesn't want to revisit it." Margaret thought about that man, whoever he was, starting over somewhere with nothing and trying not to look back. She understood the impulse. She'd started over herself more than once. "Give him time," she said. "Fear is loudest in the beginning. It gets quieter as the distance grows." Bemis looked at her. "I'll write to him again in a month," he said. Caleb came in at the end of the 2 hours, looking like a man who had been doing paperwork he hated for most of the day and had reached the end of his patience for sitting still. He looked at the spread of documents on the work table, then at Bemis, then at Margaret. "Well," he said, "we have a strong case," Bemis said. "The forgery is good work, but not good enough. There are inconsistencies in the ink composition that a document examiner will be able to identify. The proxy company trail is traceable, though it will take time. And Henry Dawson's testimony about the original negotiation is exactly the kind of direct witness account that courts give significant weight to." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "How long? 6 months?" "Possibly 8. Bemis closed his case. These things don't move quickly in territorial courts. But I believe we'll prevail. And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, the Drapers cannot act on any claim while the counterfiling is active. Your eastern acreage and your water rights are in a legal holding pattern. The land is safe for now." He paused. "As long as no one on this ranch does anything that could be interpreted as an admission or a concession." "No one will," Caleb said. He said it with such flat certainty that Bemis glanced at him and then, briefly, at Margaret, as if recalibrating something in his own calculation about the nature of this ranch and the people in it. "I'll stay through Friday," Bemis said. "I need statements from Henry and Price and possibly one or two others." He stood, picked up his case. "Miss Holloway." He nodded to her with a respect that was genuine and specific. "Your account was invaluable. I hope it helps," she said. He left, and it was just Caleb and Margaret and the cooling kitchen and the documents still spread across the small work table. Caleb looked at the papers. He looked at them the way a man looks at evidence of how close he came to something terrible, with a kind of shaky gratitude that he can't quite let himself feel fully yet. 6 months, he said. "At least," Margaret said. "But the ranch will still be here in 6 months." She began gathering the papers into a neat stack. "It'll still be here because you didn't sign those papers, and you got a good lawyer on it fast, and your men are solid." She set the stack at the edge of the table. "All of that was you." "Not all of it," he said. She didn't answer that. "Margaret," he said. She looked up. He almost never used her given name. She could count the times on one hand. Each time it happened, she felt the room adjust slightly around the sound of it, as if the word had weight that Miss Holloway didn't. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said carefully. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Not the careful, half-committed positioning he usually used in this kitchen, fully in the chair, both elbows on the table, looking at her directly. "Why are you still here?" he asked. She waited, because she could tell from his tone that he wasn't finished. He stopped. Tried again. "The job I advertised was to feed my men." "You've done that. You've done considerably more than that. You could take what you've built here, your reputation, what you've proven you can do, and go anywhere. Bitter Creek, Helena, anywhere. You could name your terms." He paused. "So why are you still at this ranch?" It was a fair question. It was also a dangerous one, and they both knew it. Margaret looked at him steadily. "Because the work isn't finished," she said. "The Draper situation." "I don't mean the Draper situation," she said. "I mean the work." "He held work?" he asked. Quiet, direct. She looked at him for a long moment, and she thought about the first morning and the filthy kitchen and 40 men who had forgotten what it felt like to matter, and Sunday pies and Henry Dawson, laughing for the first time in 6 years. And Webb's apology and Thomas at the stove and Connors riding to the telegraph office without being told twice, and the Breckenridge family somewhere 4 miles east, with enough flour and beans to make it through to spring. And Caleb at the small work table eating biscuits. And Caleb in the yard reading a lawyer's letter with his jaw tight. And Caleb at the gate with his voice completely level. And Caleb just now saying her name. This ranch needed someone to care about it, she said. Not just manage it. Care about it. All of it: the kitchen, the men, the land, the neighbors, all of it. She paused. "It still does," she said. The silence that followed was long and particular. The kind of silence that is full of things rather than empty of them. Caleb reached across the work table and set his hand over hers. Not asking, not performing, just doing it, the way a person does something that they have finally decided to stop finding reasons not to do. She looked at his hand on hers. She did not move. "I'm not a romantic man," he said. "I want to be clear about that up front, because I think you deserve clarity more than you deserve something pretty." "I appreciate that," she said. "I don't know how to say the right things at the right time." "I've been told," he stopped. "It doesn't matter what I've been told. What matters is that I'm sitting here and I'm looking at you, and I'm trying to find a way to say," he stopped again. She waited. "You are the most capable person I have ever met," he said finally. "And I don't know when it stopped being about capability." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. She looked at his hand on hers. She thought about all the reasons to be careful. She had cataloged them exhaustively over the past several weeks, in the space between flour sacks and bread loaves and the long quiet of early mornings. She was an employee. She was plus size in a world that had opinions about that. She was a woman without money or family name or any of the things that made a woman legible as a prospect rather than a problem. She had started over before, and she could start over again. She knew all of that. She also knew with the same flat, practical certainty she brought to everything else that the man across this table was honest, in a way she had not often encountered. That his slowness to say things was not evasion but precision. That he held his hat in both hands when he came to talk to her because he trying to say something respectful with his body when he wasn't sure he had the right words yet. She turned her hand over under his, slowly, and held on. "You have terrible timing," she said. He let out a breath. Something in him released. She could see it move through him. "I know," he said. "We're in the middle of a legal dispute." "I know, and I still have 42 men to feed in the morning." 43, he said. "Bemis eats breakfast." She almost laughed. She felt it move through her before she caught it. "Caleb," she said. "Margaret, this changes things," she said seriously. "On this ranch, with the men. I need you to understand that before we go any further, with whatever this is." "I know it does," he said. "I've thought about it. And I think the men already know," he said. "I think they've known for a while. I think I was the last one to say it out loud." She thought about Henry Dawson's face on Sunday evenings. About Price coming to her with the Breckenridges. About the way the men had quietly arranged themselves around her over the past weeks, like a settlement forming around a water source. "Yes," she said, "you probably were." He almost smiled. "The real one. The one that still looked startled every time it appeared." "Then nothing changes," he said, "except that I've said it." "Everything changes," she corrected, "but that doesn't mean it changes badly." He nodded. They sat at the small work table in the kitchen for a while longer, her hand in his. The ranch quiet around them, and the documents from Bemis stacked neatly at the edge of the table, like a problem that had been named and therefore shrunk to manageable size. Then Margaret stood up and said she needed to check the starter for tomorrow's bread. He stayed at the table while she did, and neither of them said anything else, and it was the most natural thing in the world. The weeks that followed were not simple. She had not expected them to be. Simple was not a thing that honest situations tended to produce. There were men who had opinions. Two of them, specifically not Webb, not anymore, but a pair of older hands who had been on the ranch longer than most, and who had the particular conservatism of people who distrust changes they didn't get to vote on. They weren't cruel about it. But she heard things second and third hand, the way she always heard things through kitchen windows and half-finished conversations, and the things people said when they thought she was occupied with the stove. Henry Dawson dealt with it before she had to. She didn't know exactly what he said. She'd made a point of not trying to find out, but she knew it had happened because the two men came to the kitchen pass-through the next morning, with a particular deliberateness that told her the visit was intentional. And they said good morning, with the specific care of people who have been recently and clearly corrected by someone they respect. She gave them extra biscuits. They didn't say anything about it. She didn't either. But Bemis, to his credit, had said nothing, not one word, not one significant glance about the change in the domestic arrangements of the Whitaker Ranch. He was a professional. He cared about land rights and forged documents and territorial court proceedings. Everything else was not his business, and he treated it accordingly. He left on a Friday, as promised, with his leather case full of statements and a handshake for Caleb and a nod for Margaret that communicated more clearly than most speeches would have. "I'll be in touch," he said, "as things develop." "We'll be here," Caleb said. He had started saying "we" without appearing to notice he was doing it. Margaret noticed. She suspected most of the ranch did too. The weeks continued. The Draper brothers, to no one's surprise, did not go quietly. A formal counterclaim arrived through the territorial court, disputing Bemis's water rights challenge and attaching a revised affidavit from a notary in a county none of them had expected. Bemis responded within a week. The legal machinery moved in its slow and grinding way, producing paper and counterpaper and the particular anxiety of a dispute that cannot be resolved quickly, no matter how clearly one side is in the right. Margaret found a way to hold all of it: the legal uncertainty, the slow rhythm of the kitchen, the changing nature of her relationship with Caleb, with the same methodical steadiness she had always brought to problems. She did not catastrophize. She did not pretend the concerns weren't real. She simply kept working, kept cooking, kept paying attention to every person on this property and what they needed, because that was the only thing she had ever known how to do that reliably made the world better. And then, on a Tuesday morning in the third month, since Roy Draper had appeared at the gate, something happened that she hadn't anticipated. She was alone in the kitchen, the breakfast rush long cleared, doing the quiet work of mid-morning prep, when she heard a wagon coming up the road. She knew Earl's wagon by its sound, the particular squeak in the left rear wheel that had persisted despite 3 repairs, and this was not Earl's wagon. She went to the window. The wagon was driven by a man she didn't recognize, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the woman sitting beside him, older, somewhere in her 60s, with a back straight as a fence post, and the particular bearing of someone who has spent a lifetime being exactly who they intended to be. She was watching the ranch as the wagon pulled in with an attention that reminded Margaret, sharply and immediately, of herself. Caleb came out of the main house. Margaret watched him see the woman in the wagon and go completely still. Then he walked to the wagon, and his face was doing something she had never seen it do before, a complicated, unresolved thing that had history in it. She stayed in the kitchen. Thomas came in from the yard a few minutes later, with the expression of someone carrying information he hasn't been asked to carry, but is going to deliver regardless. "That woman in the wagon," he said. "Yes," Margaret said. She kept chopping. "Price says she's Caleb's aunt." "His father's sister. She lives in Billings," he paused. "Price says she's never visited. Not once in the whole time he's been on the ranch." Margaret set the knife down. She thought about that. About a woman who had never visited, arriving now, without announcement. 3 months into a legal dispute and 2 months into a changed domestic situation on a ranch, she apparently had strong enough feelings about to make an unexpected trip from Billings. "Thomas," she said. "Ma'am, that bread won't shape itself." "Yes, ma'am." He went to the bread. She picked up the knife and kept going. Caleb came to the kitchen an hour later with his hat in both hands and something on his face she needed a moment to identify. It took her until he was fully in the room to name it. "Apology. My aunt is here," he said. "I know. Her Vera Whitaker, my father's sister." He stopped. "She has opinions." "I assumed," Margaret said. "About the ranch," he said. "About who runs it. About—" He stopped again. She set down the knife and turned to look at him full on. "Caleb, say what you need to say." He met her eyes. "She didn't know about you. Not specifically. She heard from someone in Helena that things had changed here, that the men were settled, that the legal situation was being handled. She came to see for herself what was happening on her brother's land. He paused. She has always believed she has a role in decisions about this property, which she does not, legally, but which she has never accepted. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "What is she like?" she asked. "Formidable," he said. She almost smiled. "I've been called that." "You're different, formidable," he said. He searched for the word. "She operates from a position of certainty about what things should look like. What people should look like. What a ranch should be and who should be in it." He was watching her face carefully as he said it. "She is going to have opinions about you specifically." "Because of what I look like," Margaret said. Flat. "Not a question. Because you're not what she would have chosen," he said. Honest, the way he always was. And because Vera Whittaker has never in her life not said exactly what she thinks. Margaret picked up her knife. "Then she and I will get along fine," she said. "I've never had much patience for people who dress their opinions up as something more polite than what they are." She looked at him. "When does she want to eat?" He blinked. "I shall eat with me, at the main table." "Then tell her supper is at 6, Margaret said. "And tell her I make a good table." "She's welcome to form her own opinion." Caleb looked at her for a moment with an expression that was complicated and warm, and something else she was choosing not to name yet. "All right," he said. Vera Whittaker appeared at the kitchen pass-through window at 6:05, not to eat, but to look, which told Margaret everything she needed to know about the woman's strategy. She was assessing before she arrived. Margaret did not go to the window. She continued what she was doing, which was plating the evening meal with the precision and care she brought to every meal on this ranch, and she let Vera look for as long as she wanted. "You're the cook," Vera said finally. "I am," Margaret said without turning. "You're not what I expected." "I've heard that before," Margaret said. "It tends to stop being said after the first meal." A pause. "You have confidence," Vera said. It wasn't entirely a compliment. It wasn't entirely not one either. "I have competence," Margaret said. "Confidence is what other people call it when they're surprised." Another pause. Longer. Margaret turned around and looked at Vera Whittaker directly. The older woman was looking back at her with the specific gaze of someone doing a rapid and thorough reassessment. Margaret held it without any performance, no sweetness, no deference, no bristle. "Just steady." "My nephew seems to trust you considerably," Vera said. "He trusts me appropriately," Margaret said. "I've earned it." "He says you uncovered the Draper fraud." "Several people uncovered the Draper fraud," Margaret said. "Henry Dawson, Clara Simmons, Arthur Bemis. I connected some of the pieces. He says without you, he would have signed the papers." Margaret said nothing. Vera studied her for another long moment. "The men on this ranch speak about you with," she paused, choosing the word carefully, "regard. The men on this ranch are good people who were hungry," Margaret said. "Not just for food. For someone to treat them like they mattered. That's not remarkable. It's just basic decency." Vera Whittaker was quiet for a full 5 seconds. Then she said, "Supper at 6, you said." 6 sharp, Margaret confirmed. "I'll be at the table," Vera said, and walked away. Margaret turned back to her plating. Thomas, who had been pretending to scrub a pot in the corner, with complete lack of conviction for the past 4 minutes, let out a breath. That was he started. "Bread needs covering for the night," Margaret said. "Yes, ma'am," he covered the bread. Supper happened. It was, by any measure, one of Margaret's better meals: roasted pork, potatoes, fresh baked bread, and a ginger cake for after that. She had decided on at 4 o'clock and executed without error. She served it and she worked, and she did not go to the main table to introduce herself, because she was not the one who needed to make an impression tonight. But she listened, and what she heard, through that pass-through window and the particular acoustic generosity of the ranch house's construction, was Vera Whittaker asking Caleb sharp and specific questions about the Draper situation, about the legal strategy, about Bemis, and then, after a pause about the kitchen arrangement. About Margaret specifically. She heard Caleb answer without hesitation. She couldn't hear the words, but she heard the tone clear, decided, the voice of a man who has stopped hedging about things he is certain of. Vera's next question was quieter. She couldn't hear it at all. And Caleb's answer was the quietest of all. She heard exactly 2 words of it. Her name. Just that, Margaret. Said the way he said it in the kitchen, with weight and without apology. She went back to her work. An hour later, after the plates were cleared and the kitchen was being set to rights for morning, she heard footsteps on the kitchen porch different from Caleb's, smaller and more deliberate. Vera Whitaker came into the kitchen. She came all the way in, not just to the doorway. She looked around the room with the thorough attention of a woman who knows what kitchens tell you about the people who run them. She looked at the clean surfaces, the organized shelves, the bread covered for the morning, the stoves banked just right. She said nothing for a moment. Then she set something on the counter. It was a folded piece of paper. My brother's recipe for molasses cake, she said. Frank made it every Christmas. He learned it from your grandmother. Caleb tells me she stopped. Corrected. From his mother. She looked at Margaret. I thought you might want it. Margaret looked at the folded paper. She looked at Vera. The older woman's expression had rearranged itself into something that was not warm. Exactly, Vera Whitaker did not appear to do warm on short acquaintance, but that was open. Genuinely open, in the way of someone who has done the honest work of revising a judgment and is showing you the result. Thank you, Margaret said. My nephew is not an easy man, Vera said. I know, Margaret said. He is a good one. I know that, too, Margaret said. Vera nodded, one single nod, precise and final, like a gavel. Good night, Miss Holloway, she said. Good night, Miss Whitaker, Margaret said. Vera left. Margaret picked up the folded piece of paper. She held it in both hands for a moment without opening it, just held it, feeling the weight of what it was, and what it wasn't, and what it might eventually become. Then she set it carefully on the shelf above the counter, in the place she kept things that mattered. She finished closing down the kitchen. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and held her own hands in her lap and breathed and thought about everything that had happened since a wagon had pulled up to a gate and she had climbed down without anyone offering to help her. The ranch was still in legal dispute. Vera Whitaker was sleeping in the main house with opinions that had not all been revised. The Draper brothers were still operating, still waiting, still calculating. None of that had resolved. But something had. She thought about the word Caleb had used at the gate that morning, we. Without noticing. Just we. She lay down. She slept better than she had since the night the storm came. Vera Whitaker stayed a week. Margaret had expected 3 days, maybe 4, long enough for a woman of her particular temperament to satisfy herself that the situation was what it appeared to be, form a complete opinion about it, and return to Billings with her conclusions intact. But Vera stayed 7 days, and by the 4th day Margaret had revised every assumption she'd made about her. The woman was difficult, yes. She was sharp and particular, and she had a way of entering a room that made everyone in it feel slightly evaluated. But she was also, Margaret discovered, someone who paid genuine attention, who listened to what was said and what wasn't said with equal care, and who had the specific courage of a person willing to change their mind when the evidence required it. On the 3rd morning, Vera appeared in the kitchen at 5:30, before anyone else was up. Margaret was already at the stove. She looked at the older woman in the doorway and said nothing. Vera came in. She sat at the small work table. She watched Margaret work in silence for several minutes. Then she said, "My brother Frank was a proud man. He would have been difficult about this." About what specifically? About a woman running things. A pause. About the particular woman you are. Margaret turned from the stove. She looked at Vera directly. And you? Vera considered that with the seriousness it deserved. I was difficult about it, she said. Past tense. Margaret turned back to the stove. What changed your mind? The men, Vera said simply. I've seen ranch hands in my lifetime. I know the difference between men who are managed and men who are. She paused, searching for the right word. Held. These men are held. By this kitchen, by you. She was quiet for a moment. That is not a thing most people can do. Man or woman. Margaret said nothing for long enough that the silence became its own kind of answer. My mother was a cook, she finally said. She told me once that feeding people is the most political act a woman can perform. Because whoever controls the table controls whether people feel like they belong or whether they don't. Vera looked at her steadily. Your mother was a wise woman. She was, Margaret said. She was also plus size, and she spent her whole life being underestimated by people who looked at her before they tasted her food. She set a plate on the work table. I inherited both things from her. Vera looked at the plate. She looked at Margaret. She picked up the fork. She said nothing more about the subject, and she didn't need to. On the 7th day, Vera Whitaker prepared to leave. She came to the kitchen one final time in the afternoon, and she stood in the doorway with her travel coat already on and her bag already loaded in the wagon outside. I'll be back in the spring, she said. If that's she stopped. Tried again. If the invitation stands. Margaret looked at her. This ranch will be here in spring, she said, and so will I. Vera nodded once the precise gavel nod that Margaret had come to understand as her highest form of approval. See that you are, she said, and left. Caleb watched the wagon pull away from the front gate with Margaret standing beside him, and after it was gone he said, that went better than I expected. She's a fair woman, Margaret said. She just needed time to look properly. She left you her brother's recipe, he said. She's never given that to anyone. I know, Margaret said. She walked back toward the kitchen. He walked beside her. Neither of them said anything about that, because some things don't need to be said to be understood. The winter came down hard on the Montana Territory that year, the kind of cold that arrives in November and doesn't release its grip until well into March. Margaret managed the kitchen with the same methodical steadiness she brought to everything, stretching supplies, teaching Thomas and 2 other younger hands the foundations of cooking that would outlast their time at this ranch. Making sure the bunkhouse had hot food delivered on the worst days when even walking to the dining hall was an ordeal. The Breckenridge family came through the winter. She knew because Mr. Breckenridge himself appeared at the gate one February morning, moving carefully on an arm that had not fully healed, to return the empty boxes and containers she had sent in October. He had a dozen eggs with him, from the 3 hens that had apparently survived everything, and he offered them with a dignity that told her exactly what kind of man he was. She took the eggs with the same seriousness with which they were offered. She made a cake. She sent half of it back with him. Henry Dawson sat in the kitchen that afternoon while she was cleaning up and said, without preamble, "You know what this ranch was like before you came?" "I have a fair idea," she said. Men were leaving, he said. Not in 1s and 2s, in 5s and 6s. Caleb was holding it together with stubbornness and not much else. Another season like that, and there'd have been nothing left to hold. He was quiet. I've been on this land 23 years. I have never seen it turn around this fast. Margaret set her cloth down. She looked at the old man across the kitchen, at his weathered face and his steady eyes, and the hands that had worked this land for longer than most of the current crew had been alive. Henry, she said. Something? You can ask me anything, he said. Did you know? When I came, did you know it would turn around? He thought about that. Genuinely thought about it, which was the thing she valued most about him. I knew something was different about you, he said. First morning, the way you talked to the men when they came through that window. Not performing for them, not trying to win them, just present. Like you weren't afraid of them, or embarrassed by them, or trying to get something from them. He paused. People can tell the difference. They always can. They just sometimes take a while to admit what they're feeling. Margaret was quiet. My mother would have liked you," she said. Henry smiled. The real one, the deep one. That she first saw over apple pie on a Sunday evening and that had never lost any of its power. "High praise," he said. The letter from Arthur Bemis arrived on the 4th day of March, and Caleb read it at the kitchen table with Margaret beside him and his hands entirely still. He read it twice. Then he set it down. "The territorial court ruled on the water rights counterclaim," he said. "Our favor. Full ruling. The Draper Proxy Company's filing has been vacated. The water rights remain with the eastern acreage, and the eastern acreage remains ours." Margaret just breathed. "And the forgery?" she asked. "Bemis says the Territorial Marshal's Office has filed charges against both Silas and Roy Draper. The falsified notarization, the forged signature, the proxy scheme, all of it." He looked up. "The rancher from the South Territory, the one who lost his operation." He agreed to testify after all. She thought about that man starting over somewhere, carrying his loss like a stone in his chest, deciding to turn around and face it. She hoped it helped him. She thought it probably would. "Bemis says it will take more time before the criminal proceedings conclude," Caleb continued. "But the land question is settled." He looked at her. "It's settled, yes," she said. "Because of a letter you sent to Clara Simmons in Bitter Creek," he said. "Because of a lot of things," she said. He shook his head slowly, not disagreeing, but doing the thing she'd seen him do when something was larger than he'd prepared himself for. "I've been trying to figure out how to say something to you for 3 months," he said. "And I keep finding reasons why it's not the right time." "What reason?" she asked. "The legal situation," he said. "Vera's visit. Winter. The Breckenridges." He stopped. "None of them were real reasons. They were just things I put in front of the actual reason." She waited. "I'm afraid," he said, plainly, without decoration. She looked at him. "Of what? Of you saying no?" He held her gaze without flinching. "I'm a practical man, Margaret. I know what I have to offer, and I know what I don't. I know this ranch is not an easy life. I know the winters are long and the work doesn't stop, and there are land agents and forged documents and Vera Whitaker appearing without warning." He paused. "And I know that you came here with 37 cents and 1 iron pot, and you rebuilt something that was almost gone. You could go anywhere. You have proven that. You don't need this ranch. You don't need me." He went very still. "I don't need you," she said. "That's true." She looked at him steadily. "I need to be somewhere I want to be. And I need to be with someone I want to be with. And I have been here 6 months, and I have wanted to be here every single day of them." She paused. "Including the hard ones. Maybe especially the hard ones." The kitchen was entirely still. Caleb reached across the table and took both her hands. "Then stay as the cook." As he stopped, he looked at her with the complete openness of a man who has finally run out of ways to be careful about something. "Stay as mine, if you're willing. If that's..." He stopped again. "I don't have a more elegant way to say it. I don't need elegant," she said. "I told you that the first day. You told me you were practical," he said. "Same thing," she said. He held her hands. She held his. Outside, the March wind was still finding every crack in the ranch walls. And somewhere in the bunkhouse, Henry Dawson was telling a story that was making 3 men laugh. And Thomas was almost certainly burning something on the back burner that she'd need to rescue in approximately 4 minutes. And the iron pot was hanging above the kitchen fireplace where she'd put it on the 2nd week. Because it belonged there. Because it had always belonged somewhere like this. And so had she. "Yes," she said. "Just that." Caleb like a man who had been holding his breath for longer than was reasonable. And somewhere in the quality of the silence that followed the warm, inhabited, full silence of a kitchen that had become the center of something the last of what had been broken on the Whitaker Ranch finished healing. Thomas burned the back burner soup, as she had predicted, and she went to rescue it without letting go of the morning entirely. Because that was the thing about a kitchen, it demanded your hands and your presence and your attention. And the world kept needing to be fed regardless of what had just happened in your chest. She rescued the soup. She told Thomas to watch his heat. He said, "Yes, ma'am." She went back to work. Word got to the bunkhouse by noon. She wasn't sure how. She never was. Information on a ranch moved the way water moves, finding its own path without anyone directing it. But by noon, the mood in the dining hall had shifted in a way she felt before she could explain it. A specific brightness in the way the men moved and talked and sat down, like people who have gotten news they didn't know they'd been hoping for. Henry Dawson came to the pass-through window before anyone else. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. He smiled. "The full one. The deep one." "About time," he said. She laughed. She hadn't planned to, but she did. And it came out clear and easy. And Henry laughed too. And behind him she heard other laughter starting up. And the dining hall sounded like a place where people were genuinely glad to be alive. Which was the best possible thing any room could sound like. The spring came. Vera Whitaker came with it, as promised, arriving on a morning in late April when the land was just beginning to green at the edges. She came into the kitchen straight in. No hesitation, as if she had decided she was going to stop treating it like a place that required permission, and she looked at Margaret and said, "I hear there have been developments." "There have," Margaret said. "Legal ones," Vera said. "And otherwise." "Yes," Margaret agreed. Vera looked around the kitchen. She looked at the iron pot above the fireplace. She looked at the shelves, organized and full. She looked at Thomas at the stove and the covered bread, and the evidence of a kitchen in the full, easy rhythm of an operation that had found its pace. "My brother would have been impossible about it," she said again. "I want you to know that. He would have taken months to come around." "How long did it take you?" Margaret asked. 4 days, Vera said. She said it with a precision that was almost pride. Day 3 was the turning point, the ginger cake. Margaret kept a straight face with considerable effort. "I'll make sure to have one ready." "See that you do," Vera said. And almost smiled. She stayed 2 weeks that spring. By the end of the first week, she had become an unexpected asset. She knew water law. It turned out, from decades of managing her own property after her husband's death, and the conversation she had with Bemis when he came for a follow-up visit was one of the more impressive legal discussions Margaret had ever witnessed from 2 feet away while pretending to concentrate on bread dough. She also had, it turned out, an opinion about kitchen organization that aligned almost exactly with Margaret's own. And the two of them reorganized the pantry shelves on a Tuesday afternoon with the combined efficiency of people who have been thinking about this particular problem their whole lives and are finally in the same room to address it. At the end of the 2 weeks, Vera gathered her bag and came to find Margaret in the kitchen. "I'll come back in the fall," she said. "You're welcome whenever you want to come," Margaret said. Vera paused. She was looking at the iron pot above the fireplace. She looked at it every time she was in the kitchen. Margaret had noticed. Every single time. "That pot," Vera said. "It was yours when you came?" "It was my mother's," Margaret said. "And her mother's before that." Vera was quiet for a moment. "It belongs in this kitchen," she said. "Yes," Margaret said. Vera nodded. She picked up her bag. She stopped at the door. She turned around. "Margaret," she said. It was the first time she'd used her given name. They both heard the weight of it. "Yes," Margaret said. "You are exactly what this ranch needed," Vera said. "Exactly. Not in spite of anything, because of everything." She held her gaze for one steady, direct moment. "My brother would have come around. I want you to know that, too. He was difficult, but he was not a fool." Margaret looked at her. "Thank you, Vera," she said. Vera left. Margaret stood in the kitchen alone for a moment and felt the full of what had been not just the words, but the landscape behind them, the particular geography of acceptance from someone who didn't give it easily or without cost. Then she went back to work, because that was always and ever the answer. The summer came. the full, warm, sprawling Montana summer, and the Whitaker Ranch moved through it with a solidity that was different in quality from anything it had known before. The eastern acreage was secured. The water rights were settled. The Draper brothers were working their way through territorial court proceedings that Bemis updated them on with regular, precise letters that Caleb read at the kitchen table, and Margaret listened to without making him feel observed. The Breckenridge family got their fence fixed in June. 6 Whitaker Ranch cowboys showed up on a Saturday morning with tools and lumber and a covered pot of Margaret's beans that was large enough to feed everyone through the working day, and Mr. Breckenridge stood in his yard with his healed arm and an expression that was trying very hard not to be overwhelmed and largely failing. His wife came to the kitchen 3 weeks later with 4 dozen eggs and a jar of honey, and the particular manner of a woman who has rehearsed what she's going to say and then forgotten it the moment the door opened. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. For the October boxes. For the February visit. For sending the men in June." "The men came on their own initiative," Margaret said. Which was true. Price had organized it. She'd provided the beans. "Still," the woman said, "still." She left the eggs and the honey. Margaret made 2 pies and sent one back with Thomas, who delivered it on a borrowed horse and returned with the report that Mrs. Breckenridge had cried, which he reported with the slightly uncomfortable accuracy of a young man who is still learning that sometimes the right response to someone crying is simply to let them. "Did you say anything?" Margaret asked. "I said the pie would keep for 3 days and she should eat it while it was still good," Thomas said. Margaret looked at him. "That's good," she said. "That's exactly right." Thomas blinked. Then he straightened slightly, in the way of someone who has been told they did something correctly by a person whose opinion they value. It would be, she thought, one of those small moments he carried forward without knowing it. On a Tuesday in August, Caleb came to the kitchen at mid-morning, unusual for him. He was typically in the field until noon, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and an expression she couldn't immediately read. She stopped what she was doing. "What happened?" she asked. "Nothing bad," he said quickly. He looked at her, and the expression resolved into something clear and decided and warm. Bemis sent a final ruling on the criminal proceedings. Both Draper brothers pled rather than go to trial. The 2 ranchers they defrauded will receive partial restitution from the liquidated proxy company assets. He paused. "It's over." Margaret set her spoon down. "Completely," she said. "Completely," he said. "Bemis says there's nothing left to contest, no further exposure for the ranch, no remaining filings or claims." "It's done," she breathed. She had not fully understood until this moment how much weight she had been carrying for 8 months, not obviously, not in a way that showed in her work or her steadiness, but present. A constant low-level awareness of the thing that hadn't finished resolving yet. And now it had resolved, and the weight was gone. She felt light in a way that surprised her. Caleb crossed the kitchen. He was still not a demonstrative man in public. He had not become someone different than who he was, which was one of the things she valued most about him. But in the kitchen, with no one watching, he put his arms around her in the simple, uncomplicated way of someone who is giving someone else the full weight of his relief to hold for a moment. She held it. "It's done," she said into his shoulder. "It's done," he said. They stood in the kitchen while the morning moved around them. And after a while she pulled back and looked at his face and saw the thing she had been watching build in him for 8 months, the particular piece of a man who has stopped waiting for the next thing to go wrong. "You should tell Henry," she said. "I will," he said. "I wanted to tell you first." She looked at him. She thought about 37 cents and a hole in her left boot and a wagon ride through the Montana Territory and a filthy kitchen and 42 hungry men and an iron pot set on a counter hard enough to ring through the yard. And the moment she had said, "I've cooked through worse than this," and meant it completely. She thought about what it was to build something, not to find it already built, not to inherit it, but to build it with your hands and your patience and your particular kind of attention, day after day, meal after meal, person by person. She thought about all the things she had been told she couldn't do, couldn't be, didn't deserve, didn't fit, wasn't right for, wasn't the kind of woman who belonged in a place like this. And she looked at Caleb Whitaker's face, and at her kitchen behind him, and at the iron pot above the fireplace that had belonged to her grandmother and her mother, and now to her, and she knew with the same flat, practical certainty she had always brought to everything that matters, that all of those people had been wrong. Every single one of them. She had come to this ranch with nothing but what she'd always had: her hands, her knowledge. Her refusal to let anyone's assessment of her become her assessment of herself, and she had built something out of it that would outlast every doubt that had ever been placed in her path. That was the truth of it. Not the romantic version. Not the prettied-up story, the plain, honest truth. The woman they said couldn't handle a ranch kitchen had become the reason the ranch was still standing. The woman they laughed at on the first day was the woman they would build a legacy around. And the iron pot that everyone had noticed and nobody had understood hanging above the fire in the kitchen that was now and irrevocably hers was not a symbol of struggle or survival or any of the sad, small words people reach for when they try to explain a life like Margaret Holloway's. It was a symbol of what happens when the right person arrives in the right place and refuses, absolutely and completely, to be anything other than exactly who she is. Some women come into a place and fit themselves to it. Margaret Holloway came into the Whitaker Ranch, and the ranch fitted itself to her. And that made all the difference.